It all started when I first met Karen. She wasn't the worst neighbor in the HOA, but she certainly wasn't the best. From the beginning, there was something about her that felt off, like she was always trying to manipulate the people around her, trying to create an image of power and influence that didn't feel earned. She lived in one of the larger homes in the neighborhood, but her success always seemed to be tied to her position as president of the HOA, not from any visible means of income. At first, I thought nothing of it. She ran the HOA with a tight grip, always ensuring her rules were enforced, always meddling in the lives of homeowners. It was clear she loved the control, but there was always something more beneath the surface. As I spent more time in the community and got to know some of the neighbors better, stories began to emerge. These stories painted Karen as someone who had built her success on manipulation and deceit, something I had never fully understood until it came for me. I had recently inherited a house from a relative who had passed away. It was a modest home in the neighborhood, but it held a lot of sentimental value. When I moved in, I had no intention of changing anything. I wasn't there to make waves. I just wanted to live in peace. However, Karen had other plans. She came to my door one afternoon, as friendly as ever, and began outlining a series of upgrades that my property would need to stay compliant with the HOA's new rules. These upgrades were, of course, not free. Karen conveniently ran a company that could perform these services. At first, I entertained the idea. After all, she was the HOA president. Surely, she knew what she was talking about. But something about the price seemed off, and when I dug into her recommended company, I found the red flags. The business was registered under a name that had no online presence, no real business history, and only a few questionable reviews. The more I looked, the more I realized I had stumbled onto something far bigger than an overpriced fence installation. It took a few more months of digging, but I eventually uncovered the full extent of Karen's operations. She wasn't just running a small, poorly reviewed business. She had built a vast empire, one that spanned across the neighborhood and beyond. Karen had been using her power as HOA president to coerce homeowners into using her services, manipulating them into paying for services that were either completely unnecessary or vastly overpriced. And it didn't stop there. Her business empire wasn't just about home improvements. It was about controlling the entire HOA, making money from homeowners' desperation, and skimming off the top. Karen's empire was built on lies. She had rigged meetings, influenced votes, and bullied anyone who dared to question her authority. She even had connections with some local contractors who were complicit in the scheme, overcharging residents for basic services and kicking back a portion of their earnings to Karen. She had an entire web of corruption, all masked by her seemingly respectable role as HOA president. No one had dared to challenge her, until now. I knew I couldn't let this slide. Karen had taken advantage of countless people in our neighborhood, and I was no longer going to be a passive observer. I had to expose her, and the only way to do that was through the legal system. But I wasn't naive. I knew that taking down someone as powerful as Karen wouldn't be easy. She had the entire HOA board in her pocket, and I would be facing an uphill battle. But I wasn't alone. I reached out to a lawyer who specialized in real estate and fraud cases, someone I trusted to help me bring Karen to justice. The more we investigated, the worse it got. I found invoices, contracts, and emails detailing Karen's schemes, and I discovered how far her manipulation extended. Karen had even gone so far as to falsify documents, claiming that certain properties had violated HOA rules to pressure homeowners into paying for unnecessary repairs. She had a team of people who helped her fabricate evidence and keep the illusion of legitimacy intact. The extent of her fraud was staggering. It was clear that Karen had been running this scam for years, using her position of power to build wealth on the backs of people who trusted her. The final straw came when I discovered that Karen had forged signatures on HOA documents to seize control of properties she had no legal right to. These properties had been taken from homeowners who had either been intimidated into selling or had been forced to pay for repairs they didn't need. It was a conspiracy that reached far beyond the HOA and into the realm of real estate fraud. But the most infuriating part was that Karen had been able to hide behind her position, using her influence to avoid suspicion and protect herself from any real consequences. I knew I had to act fast. I brought all the evidence to my lawyer, and we began preparing for a lawsuit. We weren't just going after Karen for the money she had stolen from me, but for everything she had taken from the other homeowners in the neighborhood. It was time to bring her empire crashing down. But Karen wasn't going to go down without a fight. As the case moved forward, Karen's lawyers fought tooth and nail to discredit the evidence. They tried to claim that the documents we had were fabricated, that I had an agenda, and that my accusations were baseless. They painted me as a disgruntled homeowner who was just trying to make trouble. But every time they made a move, Diana countered with more evidence, more witnesses who had been harmed by Karen's tactics. We had the truth on our side, and we weren't going to let Karen lie her way out of this. But Karen wasn't backing down. She began using every dirty tactic in the book: intimidation, threats, even attempts to manipulate the press. She thought she could scare me into dropping the case, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I had seen the depths of her corruption, and I was determined to expose her for what she truly was. Karen's tactics grew more aggressive as the legal battle dragged on. She started using the media, spinning the story to make it seem like I was the one causing trouble, the one trying to undermine the HOA. Her connections in the neighborhood and her influence over the board gave her a platform, and she used it to paint me as a troublemaker. The press coverage shifted in her favor, and I could see the effect it had on the community. Neighbors I had once trusted started to question my motives, and the support I had garnered began to fade. But Diana was unwavering. She kept pushing forward, organizing meetings with key witnesses, and gathering even more evidence. Every time Karen's lawyers tried to sidestep an issue or make an unfounded claim, we had an answer, a rebuttal, and more proof to back up our case. We were building a mountain of evidence, and every day Karen's web of lies and manipulation grew smaller. The more I learned, the angrier I became. It was no longer about the money or the property. It was about taking down the woman who had made a career out of taking advantage of others. I couldn't understand how someone could live with themselves, ruining people's lives for personal gain. And I couldn't let her get away with it. One day, Diana called with news that made my stomach drop. "We've got a lead," she said. "There's an insider who's willing to testify against Karen. Someone who worked closely with her in the HOA and knows exactly how she's been running her operations." I couldn't believe it. An insider. This was the break we needed. "Who is it?" I asked, my heart pounding. "His name is Brad. He's one of the original board members, but he's had enough. He reached out to us, said he's ready to expose Karen's entire operation." I didn't waste any time. I arranged to meet Brad in a secure location. He was hesitant at first, but after talking to Diana and seeing the evidence we had, he agreed to cooperate. Brad was nervous, but I could see the relief in his eyes. For years, he had been complicit in Karen's schemes, too afraid to speak out. But now, he realized that his silence had only allowed Karen to grow more powerful. "I've watched her destroy people's lives," Brad confessed as we sat in a quiet coffee shop, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I didn't think anyone would ever have the courage to stand up to her. But you've got the evidence, and I want to help. I'll testify. I'll tell the court everything." I couldn't believe it. This was the moment we had been waiting for. With Brad on our side, we now had an insider who could confirm all of Karen's wrongdoings. He knew how she had manipulated board votes, how she had orchestrated the false repairs, and how she had used her influence to line her pockets. His testimony would be the final piece we needed to crush Karen's empire. But as the case gained momentum, Karen's desperation reached new heights. She made one last attempt to settle everything quietly, offering a large sum of money in exchange for me dropping the case. It was a tempting offer, one that promised to make all the headaches go away. But I couldn't let Karen buy her way out of this. She needed to face the consequences of her actions. "No amount of money will make me forget what you've done," I said firmly when her lawyer presented the offer. "I'm not backing down." Diana was with me every step of the way, ensuring that we kept our course straight and true. She reminded me that this wasn't just about winning in court. It was about sending a message to everyone who had been victimized by people like Karen. We had to make sure that Karen didn't just lose. She had to face the full consequences of her actions. The trial date approached quickly, and I could feel the pressure mounting. Karen's team was going all out, trying to intimidate me with threats and legal maneuvering, but Diana stood strong. It was clear that Karen was becoming unhinged. She was losing control, and she knew it. In the days leading up to the trial, I spent every moment preparing. I reviewed documents, met with witnesses, and worked with Diana on fine-tuning our strategy. There was no room for error. We had one shot to take down Karen, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. But as the trial loomed closer, I began to realize something. This wasn't just about Karen anymore. It was about everything she had built, everything she had stolen, and the people she had manipulated along the way. And then, the day of the trial arrived. The courtroom was tense, filled with anticipation. Karen sat at the front, her usual confident demeanor gone, replaced by a nervous energy that couldn't be concealed. I took my seat beside Diana, my heart racing, but I refused to show any fear. This was the moment we would finally expose everything she had done. The trial was long, grueling, and full of drama. Karen's defense team fought tooth and nail, attempting to discredit Brad and the rest of our witnesses. They even tried to accuse me of having ulterior motives, claiming that I was just out for revenge, not justice. But each time they attempted to throw us off course, Diana had a counter-argument ready, and the evidence we presented was undeniable. Every time Karen's lawyers tried to muddy the waters, our case only became clearer. Brad's testimony was the nail in the coffin. His first-hand account of Karen's manipulation of the HOA, her falsification of documents, and her illegal activities was damning. The more he spoke, the more Karen's carefully constructed empire started to crumble. Her face grew more flushed, her eyes darting nervously as each piece of evidence exposed another layer of her lies. But just when I thought we were about to reach the final moments of the trial, something unexpected happened. Karen's lawyer stood up and made a shocking announcement. "We have new evidence that may change the course of this trial." The courtroom fell silent as they presented a supposed document that, on the surface, appeared to clear Karen of any wrongdoing. But there was something in the way they presented it that didn't sit right with me. The courtroom was silent as Karen's lawyer handed over the new evidence. I could see the smirk on Karen's face, the sense of triumph in her eyes. It felt like everything had come to a screeching halt. My heart raced as I watched the lawyer approach the judge and place the document on the desk. I could feel the tension in the air thickening. Had she managed to outsmart us at the last minute? Diana remained calm, but I saw her eyes flicker with concern. She leaned over to me, her voice barely above a whisper. This could be a last-ditch attempt to delay the verdict. Let's see what they've got. Stay focused. The judge took the document in his hands and began to review it carefully. The room was heavy with the silence of everyone watching, waiting for him to react. My mind was spinning, trying to understand what this new evidence could mean. Could it really clear Karen of everything? Had we missed something crucial? A few tense moments passed before the judge finally spoke. "This appears to be a previously undiscovered document," he said, his voice firm but unreadable. "It outlines financial agreement that could shift the liability away from Ms. Karen to another entity. I will need time to review this further." I could hear Karen's lawyer whispering in celebration, but I wasn't ready to give up. "This can't be it," I thought, my stomach turning. I glanced at Diana, and she met my gaze, her expression determined. "We've got this," she reassured me, though I could hear the unspoken tension in her voice. The judge decided to adjourn the hearing for a day to allow both parties time to review the new document. As we stood to leave, I could feel the eyes of the courtroom on me, the whispers behind my back. The game was far from over, and Karen knew it. But I wasn't going to let her win. Not now. That night, Diana and I pored over the document Karen's lawyer had introduced. It looked like an official financial agreement, but the more we examined it, the more I realized it had several inconsistencies. The dates didn't match up, and there were unusual clauses that seemed to benefit Karen in ways that didn't make sense. It had been carefully crafted to appear legitimate, but was riddled with subtle flaws. "We've got them," Diana said, a hint of a smile on her lips. "This document was forged. It's an attempt to shift blame, but we'll expose it in court. There's no way they'll get away with this." We called in a forensic accountant to analyze the document. After a few hours, he confirmed what we already suspected. The document was full of errors, dates altered, signatures forged, and figures doctored. It was a desperate attempt to cover Karen's tracks, but it was too late. We had her. Diana and I knew that the next day, we could present this evidence in court, and it would completely dismantle Karen's defense. The following morning, as the court session resumed, I could feel the tension building. I sat in my seat, my palms sweating, as Karen's lawyer began their argument. They presented the forged document as if it were the key to their case. I watched Karen's face, expecting to see satisfaction, but there was something in her eyes that wasn't quite right. Fear, maybe? Was she starting to realize that her plan was falling apart? Diana stood up when it was our turn, her posture straight and confident. She addressed the judge, calmly and methodically outlining the flaws in the new document. She pointed out the discrepancies, the impossible timelines, and the forged signatures. One by one, the pieces of Karen's fraud were being exposed. The room was quiet as Diana made her case, and I could feel the weight of her words sinking in. Karen's lawyer tried to argue, but it was clear they were grasping at straws. The judge listened attentively, but it was obvious the tide had turned in our favor. Every objection they raised was countered by Diana's calm and unwavering arguments. The cracks in Karen's carefully constructed empire were widening, and she knew it. When the judge finally spoke, his words were measured but firm. The evidence presented today leaves little room for doubt. It seems that Ms. Karen has misrepresented not only the facts, but also attempted to mislead this court with fraudulent documentation. I will need time to review all of the evidence, but I am inclined to rule in favor of the plaintiff. The air in the courtroom shifted. Karen's face, once confident, was now a mask of fury and disbelief. She knew the game was up. The judge had already spoken. It was just a matter of time before the full verdict was delivered. The weight of the situation seemed to crush her as the reality of it sank in. As I left the courtroom that day, I felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. We had won the battle, but the war wasn't over yet. Karen might have lost the case, but I knew she wasn't the type to give up easily. She had built her empire on lies, and I wasn't naive enough to think she'd just walk away quietly. But for now, at least, I had won. I had exposed her for the fraud she truly was, and that was something I could never take for granted. Diana and I sat down in the quiet of her office after the hearing, both of us still processing what had just happened. "We've done it," I said, almost in disbelief. "She's not getting away with it." "We're not done yet," Diana replied, her tone serious. "This is just the beginning. There's still work to be done. We'll need to make sure she faces the full consequences of her actions. This wasn't just about exposing her. It's about making sure no one like her can ever do this again." I nodded, feeling a sense of purpose settle over me. We had fought this battle together, but the fight wasn't over. Karen had built her business empire on lies, and now it was time to make sure she paid for every one of those lies. The days following the court ruling were a blur. The initial rush of relief from Karen's defeat was quickly replaced by the realization that Karen was not going to take this lying down. She had made it this far through manipulation, deception, and control. Now that the walls were closing in, I knew she would resort to whatever means necessary to protect herself. As we waited for the judge's final ruling, we were already planning our next moves. We had to make sure that the damage Karen had caused wasn't easily swept under the rug. There were still many people in the community who hadn't fully understood the extent of her manipulation. Many were still under her influence, and I knew she would try to rally them to her side, trying to make herself out to be the victim in all of this. One morning, as I sat down to review the final pieces of evidence we were preparing for the judge's decision, I got a call from Diana. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "We have a situation," she said. "Karen's lawyer has filed a motion to appeal. They're claiming the court made an error in the evidence handling and want the case reopened." My stomach sank. "What do we do now?" "We fight back," Diana replied without hesitation. "We've already presented everything we need. She can't just keep stalling. This is a desperate attempt to buy time. We have to push forward." That evening, Diana and I met to go over everything one last time before the next hearing. Our objective was clear. We weren't just going to allow Karen to tie us up in endless legal proceedings. We had to move swiftly and decisively. The last thing we needed was for Karen to gain any more ground. We knew she was pulling strings behind the scenes, possibly using her connections to further delay the case. But we had to stay focused. "Remember," Diana said, looking at the file spread out on the table, "the most dangerous part of this is how she works in the shadows. She's got people everywhere. She may try to use her influence to scare off anyone who stands in her way. We can't let that happen." I nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. I had to keep pushing forward, no matter what came next. If Karen was going to try to spin this appeal, we had to be ready to dismantle it piece by piece. The appeal hearing arrived sooner than I expected. Karen's legal team arrived at the court with their usual confidence, but this time there was a sense of desperation in their movements. They presented their case, claiming that the previous judgment was flawed, but they didn't have the evidence to back it up. It was clear that they were trying to delay the inevitable. Diana stood up and countered their motions with precision. She went through each of their claims, presenting irrefutable evidence that showed how Karen had manipulated the system and the people around her. "This appeal is nothing more than a stalling tactic," Diana said with conviction. "There's no legal basis for reopening this case. The facts have been presented. The evidence is clear. Karen has been exploiting her position for far too long." As the session continued, it became more and more apparent that Karen's legal team was on the defensive. The judge, a seasoned jurist who had already made his initial ruling, looked less and less convinced by their arguments. As they struggled to come up with a valid reason to justify the appeal, it became clear that their case was falling apart. I watched as Karen, sitting at the front of the courtroom, shifted nervously in her seat. Her usual confidence had been replaced with tension. She wasn't used to losing. She wasn't used to being the one on the defensive. It was a strange but satisfying sight. It was clear that Karen, for the first time, was finally realizing that she couldn't control everything. The hearing dragged on for several more hours, with Karen's lawyer making desperate attempts to turn the tide. But by the end of the day, the judge made his decision. "I've reviewed the motion for appeal, and I find no grounds to reopen this case," he announced, his voice firm. "The ruling stands. The assets will be seized, and the defendants will be held accountable for their actions." A wave of relief washed over me, but there was still a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Karen wasn't going to accept this defeat easily. The battle had been won, but the war wasn't over. I knew she would try to fight back in other ways, perhaps using more underhanded tactics to get out of facing the full consequences of her actions. As the courtroom began to empty, I watched Karen leave, her head down, her shoulders slumped. For the first time, she wasn't walking with the usual air of authority. She was just a woman who had been caught in the lies she had built for so long. I turned to Diana. "It's over, right? There's no way she can appeal again." Diana gave a small nod, but there was something in her expression that made me uneasy. "For now, yes. But Karen has always been resourceful. We have to be ready for anything." As I left the courtroom, I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and caution. Karen's empire had crumbled, but I knew better than to believe the battle was over. There were still others who had benefited from her scheme, and I wouldn't rest until they were all brought to justice. The fight had been long and draining, but we were getting closer to the end. And no matter what Karen tried next, I knew that I had the truth on my side. As the weeks passed, things seemed to quiet down, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Karen wasn't finished with her tricks. She had been beaten in court, but she was still a dangerous woman with a vast network at her disposal. Even though we had won the legal battle, I knew the war wasn't over. If anything, Karen was probably plotting her next move from the shadows, and I had to be ready. Diana and I continued to meet regularly, discussing the next steps. Although Karen's appeal had been dismissed, we knew the authorities were still working to dismantle her business empire. The criminal charges were piling up against her, and we were waiting for the moment when the full weight of her actions would finally catch up to her. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't ignore the fact that Karen still had resources, people who owed her favors, who were likely ready to fight for her if it meant protecting their own interests. The quiet period didn't last long. One afternoon, I received a call from Diana, and I could hear the urgency in her voice. "We've got a new problem," she said. "Karen's been in contact with some of her former associates. There's a plan in motion, and we need to figure out what it is before it's too late." "Do you know what she's planning?" I asked, already getting that familiar tightness in my chest. Not yet, Diana replied. But we've been able to track down a few of her contacts. They're starting to move around, trying to cover their tracks. We need to find out what Karen's up to. She's not out of the game yet. It was clear that Karen was trying to regroup, trying to build a new strategy to get herself back into power. She had always been good at manipulating people, and she wasn't going to let one loss destroy everything she had built. I couldn't afford to wait around, hoping she would give up. It was time to take the initiative. Over the next few days, Diana and I worked with some of the investigators who had helped us throughout the case. We dug deeper into Karen's connections, following leads, piecing together the movements of the people who had been involved in her operation. Slowly, we uncovered more information about the network of associates she had been using to funnel money and maintain control. It became clear that Karen's influence was still strong in some circles, and she had been using her contacts to spread misinformation about the case. People were still under her spell, believing she was the victim of a great injustice. Some were even being paid to spread these lies, creating doubt among those who had once supported her. But we weren't blind to her tactics anymore. We knew what Karen was capable of, and we knew how to counter her. The more we uncovered, the more I began to understand just how far Karen had been willing to go to keep her empire intact. She wasn't just fighting for money or power. She was fighting for her reputation, the image she had carefully cultivated over the years. I spent sleepless nights tracking down the remaining evidence we needed. We had already gathered a mountain of documents, but there was still more to uncover. A missing piece, a key witness who could expose everything. Diana and I had a breakthrough when one of Karen's former associates, someone who had been quietly watching the case unfold, came forward with information that could change everything. "I've seen enough," the man said during our meeting. "I was part of Karen's operation, but I couldn't keep my eyes closed anymore. I've got documents, communication records, everything. I'll help you bring her down." His offer was a turning point. He had worked directly with Karen, handling many of her shady transactions. He knew how the system worked, how she had manipulated everything in her favor. But it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about stopping someone who had caused so much harm. The man, whose name was Greg, had a personal stake in seeing Karen pay for her crimes. With Greg's help, we pieced together the last of Karen's fraudulent dealings. He provided us with emails, financial records, and witness statements from others who had been victimized by Karen. This was the evidence we needed to build an even stronger case, one that could not only shut down her business, but ensure that she never had the chance to hurt anyone again. The investigation was nearing its end, but as we prepared to present the final pieces of evidence to the authorities, I started receiving more threats. Anonymous messages began flooding my inbox, warning me to back off or suffer the consequences. I knew these were coming from Karen's associates, people who were desperate to protect their interests. But they only fueled my determination to finish what we had started. Each threat seemed to strengthen my resolve. I wasn't backing down now. I had already come too far, and the truth needed to come out. Karen's empire, built on lies and deceit, had to be exposed. I met with Diana again, and we discussed our final move. We knew Karen wouldn't just surrender. She would fight every step of the way. But this time, it wasn't just about taking her down for fraud. It was about ensuring that she couldn't ever rise again, that the people she had exploited couldn't be manipulated any longer. As we finalized the details, I couldn't help but feel the weight of everything we had been through. It had been a long and exhausting battle, but the end was in sight, and I was ready to finally bring down the woman who had stolen so much, ready to expose the truth, no matter what it took. ChatGPT said, the day of the final hearing arrived, and with it, a sense of dread that settled in my chest. We had gathered all the evidence we needed, from Karen's forged documents to the witness testimonies that would expose her manipulation and fraud. Yet, as the courtroom doors closed behind me, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was going to pull another trick out of her sleeve. She had always been so calculated, so cunning. What if she had something left that we hadn't anticipated? Diana stood by my side, her calm demeanor reassuring. She knew the stakes just as well as I did. "We're ready," she said, her voice steady. "We've worked for this moment. No matter what she tries, We've got everything we need." I nodded, though I could still feel the weight of the uncertainty pressing down on me. Karen's legal team was just as determined to win. They had already used every tactic at their disposal to try and derail our case. But this time, they had no room left to maneuver. It was now or never. The courtroom filled up with a buzz of hushed voices, the atmosphere thick with tension. Karen was already sitting at the front, her expression one of quiet confidence. But I could see through it. I could see the cracks in her facade, the slight twitch of her fingers, the way she couldn't quite meet anyone's eyes for long. The truth was finally catching up to her, and she knew it. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. The next few hours would determine whether Karen's empire of lies would be dismantled, or if she would once again manage to slip through the cracks. As the proceedings began, I watched Karen's lawyer take the floor, attempting to discredit every shred of evidence we had presented. They claimed that the documents were tampered with, that the testimonies were unreliable, and that we were simply trying to ruin Karen's reputation for personal gain. But every time they tried to cast doubt, Diana was ready with a counterargument. She presented the forged signatures, the witness statements, and the financial records with unshakable clarity. As the evidence piled up, Karen's lawyer seemed to lose steam. The more they spoke, the less convincing they became. The judge, a no-nonsense figure who had already heard enough, began to show signs of impatience with the defense's tactics. Then it was our turn. Diana stood up, her voice unwavering as she began to dismantle Karen's case piece by piece. She spoke with such conviction that even Karen's lawyer couldn't manage to interrupt. Diana's argument wasn't just based on the facts. It was based on the larger picture. She showed the court how Karen had used her position to manipulate homeowners, how she had orchestrated a long-term scam, and how her business empire was built on deceit. As Diana spoke, I couldn't help but feel a sense of powerlessness mixed with hope. We were so close to exposing everything. I thought of the countless people in the community who had been affected by Karen's actions, how their homes had been devalued, how they had been forced to pay for unnecessary repairs, how Karen had used the HOA as her personal cash cow. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about making sure that Karen could never harm anyone again. The defense tried to put up a fight, but it was clear they were running out of options. Karen's influence was slipping away as the court saw her for what she truly was, a fraud. It was almost surreal to watch as everything she had worked so hard to protect began to fall apart. Her empire, built on lies and manipulation, was crumbling before her eyes. Then, unexpectedly, one of Karen's former employees, someone who had been involved in the operations we were investigating, stepped forward as a witness. He wasn't on our side, but he had been directly involved with Karen's dealings. He had been one of the key people who helped her manipulate the financial records, and he was now ready to speak the truth. "I couldn't keep quiet anymore," he said, his voice shaky. "I was part of it all, helping her cover up the scams, making sure the HOA members paid for repairs they didn't need. But I'm done. I can't let her get away with it. I've seen too many people suffer because of what she's done." The courtroom was silent as his words sunk in. This was the final nail in the coffin. Karen's own people were turning against her. There was nowhere left for her to hide. Her empire of lies was unraveling, and she had no one left to protect her. I looked at Karen as she sat there, her face a mix of anger and disbelief. She had always been the one in control, the one calling the shots. But now she was powerless. The walls were closing in, and there was nowhere left for her to go. The truth was out, and there was no escaping it. But even as I watched Karen, I couldn't help but wonder, what would she do now? Would she try to run? Would she try to buy her way out of this with the last of her wealth? Or would she finally face the consequences of her actions? The judge's voice broke through my thoughts. "I have reviewed all the evidence, and it is clear to me that Miss Karen has committed numerous acts of fraud, abuse of power, and manipulation. This court finds in favor of the plaintiff." A rush of relief flooded through me. I had won, but as the judge delivered the ruling, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done yet. She had lost this round, but she was still out there, and I knew she wouldn't stop fighting. We had won a victory, but the battle for justice was still unfolding. The courtroom was buzzing with murmurs as the judge's verdict echoed through the room. Karen's empire had collapsed, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to breathe a sigh of relief. But even as the judge concluded the hearing, I couldn't shake the unease growing inside me. I knew Karen better than to think she'd simply accept her defeat. The real question was how far she was willing to go to protect what she still had left. As the gavel fell, I glanced at Karen, whose face was a mask of disbelief, her eyes darting around the room. The defeat was too much for her to process in that instant, and it almost looked like she was calculating her next move. She had the resources, the connections, and the determination to never go down without a fight. I knew that this was far from over. Diana and I stayed behind to discuss the next steps. We had won the court case, but Karen still had assets, connections, and a network of people who were loyal to her. This wasn't just a legal battle anymore. It was about ensuring she faced consequences for everything she had done. The real work was just beginning. "Don't get too comfortable," Diana warned me as we left the courthouse. "Karen is dangerous when cornered. This ruling isn't going to be the end of her attempts to escape the consequences. We need to prepare ourselves for her next move." I nodded, still feeling the rush of adrenaline, but knowing Diana was right. Karen wasn't going to take this lying down. She was a woman used to control, and losing that control was something she wouldn't tolerate. The next few days were a blur. I worked with Diana and the authorities to ensure that Karen's assets were properly seized. We began tracking her financial movements, trying to determine if she had already started hiding money or planning her escape. It was clear she was in panic mode, but at least now, we were in a position to stop her. Karen's legal team wasn't done either. They filed for a motion to delay the implementation of the ruling, claiming that they needed more time to process the court's decision. It was a stall tactic, but it was one we couldn't afford to ignore. Diana was quick to respond, making sure the authorities knew Karen was trying to buy more time. "Don't let them distract you," Diana told me in our meetings. "This is all part of Karen's strategy. If we let her, she'll keep dragging this out until she figures out a way to escape." We pushed forward, determined to make sure Karen could no longer control the HOA or the lives of the people she had hurt. We continued to gather information, now focusing on those who had been complicit in her operation, those who had helped her manipulate homeowners into paying for unnecessary services. We couldn't let them go unpunished. It was during one of these investigations that we stumbled upon something unexpected. Karen had been using her power not just to exploit homeowners, but to silence anyone who got in her way. One of her former associates, a contractor named Mark, came forward with evidence that Karen had used threats and intimidation to keep her operation hidden. He had worked for her, doing repairs that were overpriced and unnecessary, but he had been too scared to speak up at the time. Mark's testimony was a game changer. He revealed how Karen had used fear tactics to force people into signing contracts they didn't understand, how she had threatened workers who refused to go along with her schemes, and how she had manipulated others in the community to cover her tracks. With Mark's help, we were able to paint an even clearer picture of Karen's manipulation. This wasn't just about fraud. It was about intimidation, coercion, and control. But as we were preparing to use Mark's testimony in court, we hit another roadblock. Karen's people had found out about it. One evening, as I was going through some files at home, I received an anonymous tip-off. A text message appeared on my phone, the words simple but chilling. "You don't know who you're messing with. Drop this or things will get ugly." I froze, staring at the message for a moment before responding. "Who is this?" The reply was swift. "You know who it is. Let Karen go, or we'll make sure you regret it." I wasn't sure what to make of it, but I wasn't about to back down. I showed the message to Diana, and she didn't flinch. "This is exactly what I warned you about," she said. "Karen is using everything at her disposal to fight back. This isn't just legal now, it's personal." I knew she was right. The threats were real, but I couldn't let fear stop me. If Karen thought she could intimidate me, she was wrong. I had to keep moving forward, exposing everything she had done, no matter what it took. The threats didn't stop. In fact, they became more frequent, more direct. Someone showed up at my office one day, demanding I drop the case. They didn't give a name, but the message was unmistakable: back off, or face the consequences. It was clear Karen wasn't going to give up without a fight, and she was using every underhanded method to try to stop me. But despite the threats, despite the fear that tried to creep into my mind, I kept pushing forward. I knew that if I didn't stand up now, Karen would find a way to weasel out of it. I couldn't let that happen. For the first time, I felt truly empowered. The truth was on my side, and I wasn't going to let Karen hide behind her lies any longer. As the next hearing approached, the tension was palpable. Karen had exhausted every avenue she could think of to escape the consequences. Now it was up to the court to decide whether she would finally face justice or slip through the cracks again. The day of the final hearing came quickly, and I could feel the tension in the air as I walked into the courthouse. I had seen Karen at the last session, sitting across from me with her lawyer, but today, she was different. The confident air she'd carried for months seemed to have faltered slightly. She was quieter, more tense, as if she could feel the weight of everything catching up to her. I couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking. Did she truly believe she could still escape? Or was she finally starting to realize that the end was near? I was prepared for anything. Diana and I had spent the last several days reviewing our strategy, making sure every last detail was covered. We had an airtight case, more evidence than we knew what to do with, and witnesses who had come forward to testify against Karen. The documents, the testimonies, the witnesses, everything pointed to her. There was no escaping this time. It wasn't just about winning the case anymore. It was about ensuring that Karen paid for everything she had done. When the session started, the courtroom felt heavier than usual. Everyone was waiting to see how it would unfold. The judge called for the proceedings to begin, and Karen's lawyer immediately took the floor, making their usual attempt to cast doubt on the evidence we had gathered. They called our case a smear campaign, a last-ditch effort to destroy Karen's reputation. But it was clear that their arguments were weaker than ever. Karen's hold on the situation was slipping, and I could see the frustration building in her lawyer's eyes as they scrambled to find a way out. Diana stood up to make her case. With every word, she tore apart the defense's arguments, piece by piece. She wasn't just defending me anymore. She was defending the truth. She pointed out the forged signatures, the hidden assets, the illegal contracts. The documents we had uncovered were damning, and every person who had come forward with information added more weight to the case. I could feel the power shift as Diana laid it all out for the judge. Every lie Karen had told, every scheme she had executed, was now on full display for the world to see. Karen's eyes never left the floor. She had stopped trying to argue back. She was being exposed for the fraud she was, and there was nowhere for her to hide. The room had become a courtroom, a battleground where justice was being served, and Karen had no chance to manipulate the outcome anymore. The judge seemed to be taking his time, but I could sense that he had already made up his mind. It wasn't just the overwhelming evidence that had sealed Karen's fate. It was the way Diana had presented it, the calm, steady manner in which she dismantled the lies. She had shown that Karen wasn't just a dishonest HOA president. She was a criminal who had used her position to exploit everyone around her. As the session continued, I watched Karen's face become more and more twisted with frustration. I could see her grip tightening on the edge of the chair, her knuckles white as she tried to hold onto whatever power she had left. But she was powerless now. She had played her cards, and all of them had been exposed for the world to see. The judge interrupted the proceedings for a brief recess, and the room emptied out. I sat quietly in the hallway, the weight of everything beginning to sink in. This wasn't just about winning a court case anymore. It was about taking down the corrupt system Karen had built, about righting the wrongs she had done to so many people. Diana joined me in the hallway after a few minutes, her face set in a determined expression. "This is it," she said quietly. "We've done everything we can. It's in the judge's hands now." I nodded, trying to calm my nerves. It wasn't over yet, but we had done everything we could to make sure Karen faced justice. As much as I wanted to believe we had won, there was still that small, nagging doubt in the back of my mind. What if Karen had one final card to play? What if she had found some way to slip out of this? I couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of uncertainty. The doors to the courtroom opened, and everyone began to file back in. My heart was pounding in my chest. The judge had made his decision. This was it. Karen was about to find out what the consequences of her actions were going to be. The judge took his seat, and the room fell silent once again. Karen's lawyer stood up first, trying to maintain the usual air of confidence, but even they couldn't mask the worry in their eyes. The judge's gaze moved over the room, and I could feel the weight of his scrutiny. "We have carefully reviewed all of the evidence presented," the judge began, his voice steady but stern. "It is clear that Ms. Karen's actions constitute not only a breach of trust, but also fraudulent activities that have affected many individuals in this community. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff, and Ms. Karen is hereby ordered to pay restitution to all affected parties, as well as face criminal charges for her role in this operation." The words hung in the air like a final verdict. Karen's face went pale as the judge's decision was read aloud, her eyes wild with disbelief. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. There was nothing left to say. The truth had won. The courtroom erupted in whispers and murmurs, but I didn't hear any of it. All I could hear was the sound of Karen's world crumbling. The woman who had manipulated, lied, and controlled everything for years was finally being held accountable for her actions. This was the victory I had fought for, the justice I had been waiting for. As the judge's final words echoed through the courtroom, I felt a strange calm wash over me. For so long, I had been consumed by anger and frustration, chasing the elusive sense of justice that had always seemed just out of reach. But now it was here. Karen's empire had been exposed, and for once, the system had worked in favor of those who had suffered under her control. The weight of everything we had been through, every sleepless night, every piece of evidence we'd painstakingly gathered, felt like it had been lifted off my shoulders. Karen's reaction, though, was far from the relief I had hoped to see. As the verdict sank in, she seemed to shrink into herself. The confident woman who had strutted around the neighborhood, holding the power of the HOA in her hands, was no longer in control. She stood there in shock, her eyes darting from the judge to her lawyer, as if hoping they could somehow undo what had just happened. But it was too late. Her schemes had been exposed, and there was no way out now. I looked around the room, catching the eyes of a few neighbors who had witnessed the entire ordeal unfold. I could see the relief in their faces too, though some of them still looked uncertain. Karen had been the face of the HOA for so long, and it would take time for the community to recover from the damage she had done. But for now, at least, they knew the truth. They knew that someone had stood up to her and had won. As the courtroom emptied out, Diana turned to me with a smile. "You did it," she said, her voice soft but filled with pride. "This is the justice you were looking for." I smiled back, but there was a lingering sense of unease. Yes, Karen had been exposed, but her influence had spread so far, her connections so deep, that it wasn't over yet. The fight had been won, but the consequences of her actions would ripple through the community for a long time to come. Before we left the courthouse, Diana and I discussed our next steps. The authorities would take care of the criminal charges, and we were confident that the restitution for those affected would be handled in due time. But I couldn't help but feel like Karen was already plotting her next move, even from behind bars. She had been so clever in her manipulation, it would be naive to think she was finished. As we walked out of the courthouse, the sun was setting, casting long shadows on the pavement. It felt symbolic, like the final chapter was being written. But I knew that the story of the HOA, Karen, and the battle for justice was far from over. There was still much to be done, but today, at least, I could finally allow myself a moment of peace. Karen's empire had crumbled, and no matter what came next, it would be the truth that stood. Make sure you like and subscribe for more updates as we continue to unravel the aftermath of Karen's fall from power.